Good morning. So today is the final week of our 7-week prayer course, and today we're going to be tackling another very churchy phrase, spiritual warfare. Now, I have to confess that for quite a while I had no idea what this phrase meant, and it turns out that even when I thought I knew what it meant, I ended up not being entirely right. So if you're anything like me and you hear a phrase like that and think, what? Then don't worry, it is nowhere near as intimidating as it sounds. So what is spiritual warfare really all about? Well, in short, it's the Christian belief that there is inherent evil that we must always be fighting against. That enemy is Satan, whose name literally means enemy or adversary. And while Jesus' victory on the cross has meant that Satan has lost, he still tries to cause quite a lot of damage on the way out. Now, I realised that little spiel didn't really help the concept sound any less scary, so let's take the concept of spiritual warfare and break it down into the everyday with two examples. Now, the first example is this. Think about a time when you decided you were going to do something positive. Maybe you planned to reach out to someone, maybe you thought you'd help out in a local organisation, maybe you wanted to apply for a job that you knew you could make a difference in. Or maybe you're going to be creative and write something, a story, a song, a book or a poem. And now think what happened pretty quickly afterwards. Like doubts, feeling like you weren't good enough, like the person or team you were reaching out to wouldn't be interested, or the creative thing you were doing just wasn't going to be great. Maybe an obstacle was put in your path and your reaction was, okay, fine, maybe not. That's a universal thing I think we all do. We all have that moment where our confidence just gets completely shaken. So that's the first example. Now, the second one is about a temptation to do something not great. Maybe at work or school there's a culture of gossip and talking behind people's backs and you feel pulled to join in. Or maybe there's a situation where someone suggests something you shouldn't do and you have that awkward decision to make. Do you go along with it or create a fuss? Now, both of these examples both of these situations are examples of spiritual warfare. Both of them involve attacks from the enemy trying to steer us off course. The second one is simpler to understand. It's just plain and simple temptation. Although just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's actually easy to push back against. The first one, however, is more subtle. If we're in a constant battle against the enemy, the scariest thing for that enemy is for us to get out there and do something that hurts them. Right? If we talk to people about our faith, if we act differently because of our faith, that shines a light out into the world. We end up wearing our faith and our belief like a badge for all to see because it's who we are. And that, for the enemy, is terrifying. Why? Well, because the more we push back against injustice or hate or prejudice, and the more we stand up for the weak, the helpless, the downtrodden, whether on a grand scale or just by helping one person one time, the more the enemy weakens. The stronger we get, the stronger God's kingdom gets, and the weaker Satan becomes. Now my experience of this is probably best summed up by my journey in church itself. I've noticed it whenever I've stepped up to do something new, whether leading worship for the first time, or heading across the big church, or leading a service. I would always get ill in the week leading up to doing something for the first time. Every time it became a really, really clear pattern. And I was starting to get really, really frustrated with it and just doubting whether it was I could do any of it or whether maybe I was just a bit too weak. But then a very helpful person told me something that has stuck with me ever since. The enemy attacks us when we're about to do something it doesn't want us to do. We get attacked because we're about to do something that helps God's kingdom in some way, big or small. And that's the first key point I want to make. All those times when we feel like throwing in the towel because it's just too difficult, we have to remember this. We are all good enough. And that's not some empty platitude I'm just throwing out there. The fact that we're hitting these roadblocks is the evidence we need. Because if what we're doing isn't going to make a difference, the enemy wouldn't bother stopping us. It's when he's scared that he tries to intervene, because if he doesn't, we're going to succeed. You, in whatever stage of your Christian walk you're at, you scare the living daylights out of the enemy. You are dangerous in all of the best ways. But attacks aren't easy to repel, right? So what do we do? Temptation is real and doubts are real. So how do we overcome them? Well, this is where we come back to prayer. And as we've been looking at the Lord's Prayer all series, let's start there. And the first thing you should know is that the early church actually added the ending of the Lord's Prayer, for the kingdom, the power and the glory bit. That wasn't there when Jesus taught it. Do you know what the final line was when Jesus taught it in the book of Matthew? And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. That's it. That's the last line. If Jesus was doing a talk, that was his conclusion. We've praised, we've asked for stuff, we've done the forgiveness thing, and now we're asking for strength. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Basically, help us to avoid going that way, and instead give us strength to go your way. That takes two things, discipline and courage. And it turns out prayer is the key to both. So first, discipline. Developing a habit of prayer establishes a discipline. So because it's something we commit to. If you want to go further than that, you can pray and fast. In fact, the very next thing Jesus teaches after the Lord's Prayer in Matthew is fasting. Well, I think we're all familiar with giving something up for Lent, but fasting is just essentially that again. It's giving up something that we would otherwise want and dedicating the time and the thought that we would give to that to God instead. So that establishes a discipline, and because we get used to resisting having something that we'd want, it's the perfect preparation for dealing with temptation. And then the second thing, courage. Again, prayer is the answer. You often hear Christians talking about not doing things in our strength, but doing things in God's strength. You've probably heard that phrase quite a lot. But what does that really mean when we're actually trying to do something? Well, first of all, by being in God's family, we already know we're on the winning side. You know, Jesus has won. Satan's fate is sealed, so that helps. But also, the Spirit lives within us. So when we're asking for help, it's not from some distant being, it's from within. The strength to do whatever God wants us to do is already within us via the Spirit. And that's something the enemy will never ever have. Ultimately, it's about choices. As Pete Greig puts in his book, our free will can release or restrict God's will for our lives. So let's release his will. Let's say no to temptation. Let's be proud of who we are and finish the PRAY course by saying yes to God.